Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a real special treat for you guys, something that I'm really excited about. We have John Loken. Hey, John,
Hello, Dale.
welcome to the show. This is your first time on, I think.
It is, yeah. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, no problem. You're most welcome. Yeah, and, this is kind of continuing on for folks at home in the audience and stuff. So I heard this Shroud skeptic Matt Dillahunty kind of come out, and he said, "Look, only biased religious Christians would ever be pro-Shroud or believe that the Shroud is authentic." So I wanted to kind of contradict that. I've had Barry Schwartz on as a non-religious Jew. He's Jewish. He's not a Christian at all. I've also had a religious Muslim, Arif Khan, on the show, and he's pro-Shroud as well. And today we're going to have a non-religious agnostic on the show. So yeah, that's where John comes in here. But maybe the first thing is just turn it straight over to you to kind of introduce us as to who you are, where you're coming from on the Shroud research, and a little bit about your faith journey, if you don't mind sharing.
Sure, yeah. You asked. I'll take a few minutes here if you don't mind. As you said, I'm an agnostic, like many people, I must add, and a non-believer in any specific religion. I'm not an atheist, but have been an agnostic since the age of 30. Before that, I was a Christian of sorts, semi-Christian, you could say, for several years. And so therefore, I do feel like I have an interesting perspective. I know both sides of the fence. In terms of nationality, obviously, well, I could be Canadian or American, happen to be American from the Midwest, close to Canada. Sometimes I wish I were Canadian, but that's my situation. And then age-wise, in my 60s now, I mention that only because it means I've had time to read many, many books and to observe life for many decades. So that helps in my forming judgments of that sort. Career-wise, I've done many different occupations. I like variety in life, so have bounced around a bit. Academics is probably the most important subject to mention next. And I should say I have two degrees. I have a degree in history and another one in literature and languages. In addition to those, I've also studied at the university level comparative religion and philosophy and theology, a bit of Greek and Latin too. So in all, that's my background, which I hope qualifies me to speak about the Shroud. Also, politically, I'm not of either party. I'm more of an independent, a centrist, and I can see the virtues of both sides of an issue. In some cases, I am definitely strongly one way or the other, but in general, I'm a moderate. So again, I hope that might persuade some people that I'm reasonably balanced about judging such matters. Other beliefs would be an interesting topic. I don't have any interest in paranormal phenomena, UFOs or things like that. They're certainly interesting, but I just don't bother researching it myself. So all in all, I hope that gives me a pretty good position for judging the term Shroud fairly. Other things, let's see, I've written on other subjects too, including big subjects. A major concern of mine has been the phenomenon of copycat crimes. And I've made some discoveries, put those online on YouTube, actually. It's very useful to have the ability to put photographs online through YouTube. So, and the channel is, what is it now? OTF 2000. OTF 2000. That's about all in terms of my general background. And then, Dale, you asked about my journey to agnosticism. I come from a family that was nominally Christian, but not seriously so. And first started to appreciate religion when I was, 18 years old. I heard the late night radio broadcasts of Alan Watts. Does that ring a bell?
Watson.
No, Alan Watts. He was a very popular speaker in the 70s, way back in the 70s. So this is a long time ago. He was a former Anglican priest who moved into Eastern religions and became very, very knowledgeable about Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on. So anyways, that's my initial exposure to religion. At age 20, I started college, focused immediately on history, and began with Western civilization and survey. Got also a lot of the humanities, art history, architecture, music, and so on. And let's see, at the time then in my 20s, I considered myself a Christian, not a very good one, but semi-Christian certainly, and mostly maybe a cultural Christian. I was just so much in awe of the artistic achievements in terms of civilization that Christianity had produced. Medieval churches and cathedrals were really heaven to me. And then, of course, many of the moral achievements as well. It has certainly been, of course, pro and con. It's a religion that has had its defects in that regard, and many of them in very serious ones, but it's also accomplished a lot of great ethical works. So in the 80s, however, at age 30, I became non-religious for the usual reasons you've doubtless heard from others. People become either atheists or agnostics or similar position. The concept of hellfire just seemed a bit rather barbaric to me, so I couldn't buy that. I never really did believe in it, but that was one of the final straws in my case. Also, miracles were hard to accept. The notion of a substitutionary punishment, that is the atonement of the cross, also seemed to me very hard to accept. And then finally, maybe the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, especially innocents, children, and others. So that's the reason I backed out, left the fold. I've had no relapse since then into religion, although I should say that I do have a lingering affection for the natural religious philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, which you certainly do know about. Which I first studied way back in 1980. Another of your questions was that about the Turin Shroud, how I got involved in the Shroud. It goes way back to the 70s. I was a teen, 17, 18, 19, and I did read the newspaper articles that came out at the time, my first ever exposure to the Shroud, and was mystified like everyone else, fascinated. I never followed up on it, though. I just considered it another mystery.
Sorry, was this back in the 70s? Are you talking about like when the STIRP stuff came out, or is this before?
It very probably was. Yeah, I'm not able at this stage to time it so exactly, but I'm sure I saw the STIRP reports and also maybe a few others before, conceivably even 76. So anyways, no opinion, no real thoughts one way or another. And naturally, I read the usual articles every several years in the newspapers and so on. And then something very interesting happened. In the late 1990s, now I was an agnostic and had not bothered about religion for many years. But for some reason, I picked up the New Testament and read the empty tomb scenes in the Gospels. And I was really amazed to see this figure or the figures of the angels in the empty tomb. And I noticed that they were all described as young men or men, and there was always one or two of them, and they were always described as dressed in white or in radiant apparel. And then finally, in three cases, three of the Gospels, it said that they're sitting in the tomb. And those four factors made me just sit up, and I said to myself, by golly, that's the Turin Shroud. That's an allusion to the Turin Shroud in this ancient writing. And we have to remember that the Gospels were transmitted orally by means of the oral tradition for some decades before they came to be written down. And so it made perfect sense for me, especially with my literary background, to read allusions into those figures in the tomb. It could be a case of garbled allusions, meaning the reader or the writer of the Gospels really didn't know what was going on there, or they could have been veiled references to the shroud. I'm still undecided on that. So, and then soon after that, that was in the late 90s, and then about 2002, I had the great privilege of visiting. I was traveling overseas, had the privilege of visiting Jerusalem, and I spent an entire week in the old city, staying there, and did all the walking tours and saw all of the famous landmarks. And so that brought me nearer to the question of the empty tomb, of course. That same year, I also read the Gospel of Mark itself, and I was really amazed to see, I read the whole Gospel and was amazed to see that the empty tomb scene ends with no, or I should say the Gospel of Mark itself ended originally with no resurrection scene. It ended at chapter 16, verse 8, when the women proclaim the resurrection, but they don't, actually they're afraid of what they see in the tomb. They're afraid of it. But there's no actual description of a physical resurrection of Jesus. A few lines were later added, several verses were later added, scholars guess in the 2nd century. So that's the situation. And then I also learned that the Gospel of Mark was apparently the first gospel written, whereas in the New Testament, it comes second after Matthew. And when you realize that the very first gospel written was Mark, and there was no resurrection scene in it, that got me to thinking more and more about the empty tomb. And let's see, so I was putting these different ideas together in the early 2000s, the empty tomb, the resurrection question, and so on. And it's finally started to gel and came together in my mind, and I wound up writing a short book in 2005 on the subject, and came to be called the Shroud Was the Resurrection, meaning that, in my view, the vision of the shroud image was so astonishing to the early followers. They were bereaved, they were distraught, they were desperate for hope. And when they saw it, it's a beautiful image. When they saw it, they were inspired to believe that God had rescued Jesus and so to say, resurrected him. So that was the beginning and so on of my Shroud of Turin, adventure, you could say, my journey. And since then, I've been sporadically participating online in a Shroud forum, have made a number of posts on it. And also then about 3 years ago, I wrote an analysis of the whole King Abgar question back in Edessa, and that would be the 3rd or 4th century, although in the legend it's the 1st century, of course. But he first appears in literature in the writings of Eusebius, who wrote in the very early 4th century. So that's called the Vision of King Abgar in Eusebius, considered as the Shroud of Turin. I don't make any claims there that it is the Shroud of Turin that is related in the vision, or even probably is. I don't claim it, but I do say that it seems to me very possibly the Shroud of Turin that is alluded to by that vision. So that's all.
No, awesome. Yeah, so I promise you no follow-up because I know I do have a follow-up for you off screen, I guess. Unless you, okay, cool. So, okay, so kind of focusing in on the Shroud then. Obviously, you are kind of a Shroud expert. You know, I've seen you on the Shroud Science Group going back and forth with Hugh Ferry. I've enjoyed a lot of your conversations and stuff. But I just want to. Oh, sorry.
Oh, just thank you for that.
Oh, no problem. So yeah, I want to turn it to you as someone who's doesn't have this religious bias in the game. You know, what are your current beliefs regarding the Shroud's historical authenticity? Why do you, as an agnostic, take this pro-Shroud position on the historical question?
Right. Yeah. Good question. Thank you very much. I think I would best say not necessarily pro-Shroud or even pro-authenticity, but I'm just pro-science. I'm pro-truth. So that's a short answer to your question. And meaning, in other words, that the shroud is the actual burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century AD. But I don't believe that it has a supernatural origin. Again, I probably alluded to that just now previously. In terms of the evidence that has convinced me, I would say it's the totality of the evidence, all of it together, not any one or two things really, but the totality of it, the historical evidence in documentary sources and art history, and then also, of course, the forensic evidence, which is really overwhelming in my mind. So we have hundreds and hundreds of pieces of evidence that all point toward its authenticity. Just to cite a few of the historical items, you've got numerous references, written references to an image on a cloth in the 1st millennium, an image of Jesus on a cloth, either his face or his full body. And once, I believe, at least once, even it refers to his naked body. And of course, that's a perfect match with the Shroud of Turin. Then you've got the coins, the Byzantine coins, solidus gold coins from the 7th, I believe, century, maybe 6th, and they also show remarkable similarities to the shroud. Even in one case, I think the crease across the neck that is seen in the shroud, it's reproduced in some of those coins. So that gets pretty close to being the same thing. Let's see. Also, the Hungarian Prey manuscript, you've talked about it in your show probably several times. And that's
Sure.
oh, right. Yes, maybe we have. And I don't have time here to go into the details, so this is just a little refresher. But basically, it dates from the year roughly 1190. And as the name Hungarian tells you, it was done, the illustration was done up in the area of Hungary. And it shows several similarities to the Shroud of Turin. And your viewers can, of course, search the subject later on at their convenience and note down which of them are most convincing to them, or not, as the case may be. Also, the geographical route that the shroud seems to have taken makes perfect sense to me. It's very logical geographical route from Palestine north to Syria, then west to Constantinople, which today is Istanbul, of course, and then eventually over to France. That makes excellent sense. We know that there was a mysterious cloth in Constantinople in 1204, several references to the shroud or the linens of Jesus there. And it so happens that the Crusaders of the Fourth Crusade, who sacked Constantinople and carted away many of its relics, most of them were Frenchmen. Most of them were Frenchmen, or if they weren't the majority of Crusaders, the French were the largest contingent. And so it's no surprise to me that the shroud, or let's say a cloth very, very similar to the one that had been described in Constantinople, found its way over to France. It then reappeared, or some say appeared, in about 1356, and it did not appear in Spain, did not appear in Germany, did not appear in Ireland or England or Sicily or Denmark. It appeared in France. And again, that connection between the Crusaders being French and the location then of the shroud in the 14th century seems to me a strong one. Let's see, with regard to medieval forgery, or some say it wasn't a forged burial shroud, but rather a liturgical cloth. I would simply observe that if the artist who made the shroud had made a single mistake, even just a single little mistake, a slip of the brush, it would have revealed to us today that it was a man-made object. Mm-hmm. So I find it extremely hard to believe that any artist of the time could have been so perfect as to produce such an artwork that is 100% perfect, without flaw, without any obvious mistake like that. Let's see. Another reason, of course, as you've heard me say already, another bit of evidence, or tentative evidence, at least for my belief in the shroud as being authentic, is that it does not have to have been supernatural. And I think a lot of people are turned off by that supernatural claim, which some shroud supporters declare a little bit too openly. And so, in my opinion, we have this alternative, which is a natural explanation. It's not yet fully explained, but it stands at the moment as an alternative. So that is also a factor in my belief. Several others in the field have been supporters of a natural image formation. I'll name a few. The very first scientist who ever examined the shroud, only by photographs, but very, very carefully. That was in 1902. His name was Yves Delage, and he was a Frenchman, a professor of, I believe, comparative anatomy in Paris at the Sorbonne. So we're talking high-level academic. Also, and he was convinced, although he was...
But also an agnostic, just for the audience kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Agnostic too, yeah. And he researched it for a couple of years, and then he finally made a presentation announcing his belief that it was genuine, it was authentic. And then he had a student at the time, I believe, who later became a professor in his own right, Paul Vignon, and he researched the shroud for many years then. He was a Christian, but he also came to believe in, or believed very soon, that the image was a natural image. It was due to not a supernatural act, but rather nature acting, in particular vapors from the body, maybe a combination of sweat and so on. He had a theory of vaporography. So that's another one. More recently, Thomas de Wesselo wrote a book called The Sign, published in 2012. And he too supported the idea of a natural formation of the image, biochemical. And then there have been others as well in the field. Dr. Alan Adler, he was a member of STIRP. Barry Schwartz, I believe, is a believer in a natural formation. He's the founder of Shroud.com, of course, and still others. So maybe that's enough.
Yeah, no, awesome. Okay, interesting. I think there's a lot of good stuff that you mentioned there, including stuff that I've talked about on some of my shows as well. So, okay, so I hear what you're saying. These are kind of your principal reasons for thinking that it probably does belong to Jesus. So it was to the historical Jesus. But what about the evidence, right? You're a strict agnostic, you follow the evidence. There's evidence on the other side that Shroud skeptics like to give, the infamous 1988 carbon dating, or the 1389 Darcy memorandum, or people like Hugh Ferry have mentioned the papal bull saying that you can only call it a representation. So what's kind of your take on some of these skeptical evidences?
Right. And they are serious objections to the authenticity. I suppose they should be considered and have been, and they are, especially the first one, the carbon dating of 1988. That's my stumbling block. So I'm not a complete believer in the authenticity of the shroud, but I would certainly say, in my opinion, it is probably authentic. Now, the carbon-14 dating, as you've heard from so many other guests on your program, there are serious problems with it, of course. And several different explanations have been offered for the misdating, if it was a misdating, to the years 1260 to 1390. We don't need to go into those various options now. I'm sure you all know about it. The labs did do a rather bad job of the testing. That's well established, very well established by Joe Marino and other people too. So let's see. As for the Darcy memorandum, you mentioned that. To me, it's an interesting case. Although I got involved in the Shroud way back in 2003 or so, that never did interest me as a subject. Until about a year ago. And I think the main reason is the shroud that we have today is the very same one that Darcy, Pierre Darcy, bishop in the city of Troyes in north central France. It's the same one that he wrote about. He wrote complaining about its being shown and declared to be the shroud of Jesus. He said it was a fake and so on, that they had found the artist who produced it. But the fact that we have that same shroud today, and that all of the modern scientists of the 20th century and 21st century have not been able to figure out how it could possibly have been produced by human beings, that trumps the claim of Darcy and those modern day scholars who cite him as an authority. I just can't believe that a 14th century bishop's word would be more convincing than the words and findings of all of these recent scientists, high caliber scientists. So there's that. Also with Darcy, there are some issues. There's a lot of fine articles written about him, as you know, Dale, and they're on, especially on Shroud.com. I suggest or invite your listeners to read a few of those, at least, maybe even several, get a better idea about it. There have been, for example, suggestions made that he was an avaricious man and that he made this accusation of fake out of greed. He wanted the pilgrims to come to his city instead of to the small village where Lire is called, where the shroud was being displayed. It's about 15 miles, I believe, from Troyes. And so that's one factor to consider. Another is that even if he wasn't avaricious, we know that his cathedral was seriously damaged the same year. And so he was apparently in financial desperation. Okay, so he may have been a perfectly decent man, but he was in financial desperation, which caused him to want the pilgrims to come to his city and not go down the road to tiny little Lire. So that's another factor. Also, he may have been a perfectly sincere believer that the shroud was fake. After all, he didn't know any of the potential history of it. He knew nothing at all about these mysterious images that had occurred, been seen and written about in the Byzantine world for 1,000 years. He knew nothing about any of that. And the shroud itself, it's a freakish object. It's truly freakish, right? It's a long, narrow cloth, about 4:1 length by width, and it shows a double image of Jesus. Who would have expected that in the Middle Ages? A double image, unheard of. Also, it shows a naked image that also was unheard of, almost, not entirely, but almost, and other things as well. So he could have been perfectly sincere in thinking that it was not the real thing. So that's my take. I'm sort of presenting a superficial case here. I'm sorry. I don't have all the facts at my fingertips. I may have made a little mistake or two, but we don't have time to go into those details. So.
Yeah, no worries. No, I think you're doing a great job. One thing, just a quick little follow-up, just for a couple, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One thing that when I talked to Hugh Ferry about the fact that it's very rare for Jesus to be portrayed naked, he was kind of, well, no, they do it all the time in his baptism scenes. But I don't know if you've heard that. Like, what is that? What's that about? Is there truth to that, or do you think that?
Could you repeat his being portrayed naked? Oh.
Yeah, like they'll even show his genitals in certain him being baptized scenes.
Yes, I can picture right now a painting of him being baptized, in which Jesus is shown naked as an adult man. However, it's interesting. He's in a river. If it's the same one we mean here, same one. He's standing in a river, and the river is sort of a greenish color. It's so it's not perfectly see-through. It's not clear, and therefore there's some discretion to the depiction of his nakedness. It's not blatant. It's not, and in the case of the shroud, we don't see the front of him in private parts naked, but we do see quite clearly the rear end, and that would be, I don't know of any other depiction of Jesus. There may be a few, but certainly not many.
Gotcha. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. So, all right. So kind of turning away from like the historical aspect. So you've mentioned that there's also this forensic or scientific evidence. People like Yves Delage started this.
Yes.
So like, yeah, I want to turn it to you. Like, what is some of the forensic evidence that you think demonstrates? Yeah, look, this shroud covered a real human corpse. It covered Jesus' corpse. Yeah, and what do you make of as well?
Although I think, great question. Let me just preface it with one little sentence or two about the modern scientists not having been able to reproduce the image. There has been an offer out by, I believe it was made by David Rolfe, the editor of the British Society for the Turin Shroud, and it's been out there for several years. It's an offer of £1 million sterling. That's £1 million British pounds for anyone today who can replicate the Turin Shroud, and no takers so far. Okay, so that tells you something. They've been trying to replicate it, and they've done some very superficial replication, but no prize-winning achievements in the area of reproducing many of the features, a dozen or 2 dozen features of the Turin Shroud. So
Gotcha.
anyways, that's that. Back to your question now about the forensic evidence. Let's see. It's perfect anatomically. The image that we see on the shroud, just perfect, 100%. Not a single hair out of place, as we might say. He also, in terms of the blood has finally been established, if it wasn't long ago, as being real blood. One famous scholar, researcher, Dr. Walter McCrone, was disputing that for decades, that it was real blood. He didn't like the idea. He was a shroud skeptic, and so he went on and on about it. Lots of people believed him. He's quoted in many of the shroud skeptic books and so on. But that's now been refuted. It is indeed blood on the shroud. We cannot say, however, that it was human blood. Now we know that. A couple decades ago, people used to say that it was human blood, but that's actually been refuted now. It can be blood. It can be human blood, certainly, but science is not able to prove that fact. The state of today's science, 30 or 40 years ago, it looked like the other way, but it's not. I'd like to recommend, by the way, an excellent article on the blood by a researcher named David Ford, who I otherwise don't know of, but he wrote a great article in the year 2000. I believe it's called The Turin Shroud and the Blood Images, and it's on shroud.com for anyone who's interested. Excellent article.
For the audience, I'll just say I've linked to that David Ford paper. I think
Have you?
Shroud Solo Shows Part 7 or Part 8. So yeah, check that out. But back to you.
Nice, yeah, nice that you know it too. That's great. Yeah,
it's a great paper.
And then there's the question of the blood patterns, which is a very interesting one, and the shapes of the stains and flows on the body. Again, they look very, very realistic, perfectly realistic, as compared to medieval artwork, paintings and so on of Jesus, say after the scourging or during the Passion. So many people might like to look for those images online, the pictures, browse among several dozen, and just see how inaccurately the artists, as great as they were in their day, as great as those artists were in the 14th century, 13th century, how inaccurately they actually portrayed the bloodstains. So that's one factor. There's also the so-called fascinating and really weird feature of the blood belt across the back of Jesus on the shroud. It's a rivulet of blood that runs across the lower back of the man in the shroud, and it would not have been produced by anyone using the Gospels as a source to paint the dead Jesus. It would not have been produced because the blood belt is not mentioned in the Gospels, not mentioned in the New Testament, not mentioned anywhere in all of Christian literature. It suddenly appears on the Shroud of Turin, which at that time in 1358, 56 was simply called the Lyre shroud. And it's a weird feature of the body. There's no reason for an artist to have introduced that on his depiction of Jesus. He had enough details to go with from the shroud, the Gospels. So unique, really. And it bears every sign of being real. It's very realistic. You can see there the meandering flows and so on. In terms now of applying the blood, there have been some strange ideas put forth by Shroud skeptics about how the blood could have been applied. One of them is the notion that a pipette, I hope I've got the pronunciation correct, a pipette or pipette was used, which is a straw. And scientists have used that in medical labs and so on. Even up to recent decades, back in the 50s, they were still using pipettes. What they would do is they would suck up a bit of liquid that was being used in a test, and then they would move the straw over to a petri dish or whatever and let the liquid out. And that's one theory for how the blood came to be applied by medieval artisan or craftsman who supposedly produced the shroud. To me, that sounds really far-fetched. Okay, I don't believe that the pipette method would work. One reason being, we know that the blood that went onto the shroud was semi-dry. It was not fully liquid. It was semi-dry, semi-solid. And to imagine someone, an artist, trying to suck up into a little straw semi-solid blood, it's like a very thick malted milkshake. It's just not going to work well. And then to skillfully deposit it on the shroud in precisely the right places, to me, it's an untenable idea. So
That's interesting. I never heard of the pipette hypothesis. I guess that was falsified long before I got into shroud studies there, but that was interesting.
Yeah, that's about all I have to say about the pipette. Then one more thing, the nail hole. We all know it's been mentioned over many decades, the nail hole in the hand or wrist of the man on the shroud. And it's been accurately noticed that it's placed actually at the base of the hand. It's not in the middle of the palm. And that's important because so many of the medieval representations of the crucifixion of Jesus had the nails through the center of the palm. And if that had happened to a crucifixion victim, the nails would have ripped out from the weight of the body. And so the Romans knew what they were doing. They knew that the nail should be inserted in the base of the hand or in the wrist, the area where you have the wrist bones, many little wrist bones, and that would hold it in place. So that's yet another bit of forensic evidence for the authenticity case.
Awesome.
Oh, I might continue if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So the scourge wounds are an interesting case. Many of them are rounded scourge wounds, okay? And they're highly realistic. They overlap with each other and they're coming at the body from different angles. All of them very realistic. Medieval paintings of Jesus being scourged or after he was scourged typically show, actually, they very often show no wounds at all from a scourging. It's amazing. But those that do so show scourging wounds will have often just straight lashes, or if they do show round wounds, they are not realistic. They're just kind of polka dots on the body, random polka dots, showing no pattern to them. And so again, that pattern of that highly realistic pattern of the distribution of the scourge wounds especially on the back of the Turin Shroud man, point toward authenticity and a crucifixion victim such as Jesus. So I might say though, I'm glad that the skeptics, authenticity skeptics, propose scenarios. It makes the authenticity believers work for their results, not too complacent and not too self-congratulatory. It would be bad if authenticity supporters got lazy in their thoughts, and they have at times, me too. So it's good to be challenged by these alternative scenarios. It helps move forward, I think. So.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Awesome. Yeah. I think, yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. And all those various features that you mentioned, you know, I don't see how people can deny that it covered a real human body, real human corpse at this point. So yeah, I think it's fairly conclusive there. So, okay. So in your answers, you have kind of confirmed, in terms of, you know, what I call the minimal relevant features, but basically all those like physical or chemical properties that the shroud images have, things like superficiality or uniformity and that sort of thing. I just want to ask you, like, what's your take on that? Do you affirm all of those findings? And, you know, obviously many atheists and skeptics will come back and they'll say, look, the STERP scientists can't be trusted at all. I had Alan on my show and he was saying they're just a bunch of pseudoscientists that, you know, you can't believe any of the findings that they got during STERP. So what's your take on
Right.
that?
Right. Yeah. One hears that sometimes out there. It's unfortunate. I think uh, it is understandable in a sense, slightly understandable that skeptics would make that claim. The STERP group, they were the group of scientists that examined the shroud in October of 1978 for 5 days in Turin. 24 hours a day too. It was being examined round the clock. Lots and lots of experiments were conducted. And several of them were Christians. And the leader was very Christian. He's quite Christian, Dr. John Jackson. But that's not enough to throw into doubt their findings. They were very thorough. Took a few years then to examine, investigate their results, and produce some excellent papers. Also, several of them were not Christians. I believe there were one or two agnostics in the group. I believe 3 Jewish members also. And so you got quite a rounded group of people there. 1 or 2 liberal Christians too, and maybe not so inclined towards supernatural explanations. So my opinion is Dr. Jackson and his team did an excellent job. There may have been some minor faults here and there or shortcomings. They wanted to conduct many more experiments, so they were really eager to do so, but they were not not allowed to do that. So it's unfortunate. It might have helped clarify a lot of matters that have become controversies ever since, but that's life. Anyways, they were there for 5 days and accomplished quite a bit. So that's my take on STERP.
Cool. And you would say, so you do confirm like all of those features, you know, the 3-dimensionality, vertically mapped.
Right. I can't, I'm not a scientist and I have no real scientific background besides doing my general requirements back in college a million years ago. So I'm not qualified at all to really judge them. But from everything I've read, yes, I'd give them, an A grade.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. So that kind of leads us into the question then of how the images were formed. You've kind of hinted that you prefer to stick with a naturalistic type explanation. So I just want to ask you in the first place, so what is your take on the various artistic explanations that have been proposed to explain that? Do you think there's any merit to any of them? Or have they all just been totally refuted in your view? And likewise, maybe getting into some specifics on the opposite end. What about those who propose supernatural or like radiation or, corona discharge, that kind of thing? What are your takes on these types of hypotheses?
Right, right. Well, as far as the artistic hypothesis goes, it seems to me, and your viewers, they can browse online and see hundreds of pictures of medieval paintings of Jesus, and and then compare them to what we have on the Turin Shroud. And to me, there's really no comparison. The details that are depicted on the Turin Shroud are just phenomenal. Also, one thing Stirp established was that there was no paint on the shroud, apart from really minute microscopic specks of random paint that had come from copies that had been perhaps dabbed on the original shroud itself, but otherwise no paint, also no brush strokes. So again, that version of the medieval hypothesis drops out of play. And then there was also the what is it called? Contact print theory, that a cloth was laid over a statue by a medieval artisan or craftsman. Unfortunately, that one fails too, because the image on the shroud involves not only some contact with the body under it, but also some projection of some mysterious sort from the body to the cloth, which covered a space of up to, I believe, 4 or 5 centimeters, say an inch or two. And of course, a medieval craftsman was not capable of doing that. So the artistic hypothesis, to me at least, it fails. Unless they can come up with a better one, I can't see it. Now then, the supernatural hypothesis, that's very interesting. As an agnostic, of course, I don't believe it. To begin with, it would seem that if it's a supernatural product, it would show a resurrection. But the fact is that Jesus, as depicted on the shroud, is dead. He's actually dead. He's in his tomb and he's dead. He looks very serene and very impressive, and his body is neatly composed, and it's inspiring, really. And with the hazy, cloudy outlines of the image, he gives off a certain glow, you can say, which is a very moving and positive one. But it's not, in my opinion, it's not supernatural. So there's that. Another problem with the supernatural hypothesis is that many of those who believe it will say that the cloth then collapsed where it was, and that Jesus disappeared while he was laying in the tomb on the bench there, the burial bench. And the cloth simply collapsed down to the tomb. And they often make that claim a little too strongly. Myself being interested in literature and scripture and languages also, I looked very closely at the Gospels, and the Gospels do not say anything at all about a collapsed cloth. They just simply say, the two Gospels that refer to the cloths in the tomb after the women come to see them, they simply say that they were lying there, or they were laid there. That's all. Nothing about being collapsed. So that's a big problem with the collapse theory. It doesn't mean that they were not collapsed. Doesn't mean that the shroud was not collapsed. It just means that there's no textual evidence for it, and that shroud supporters shouldn't make that claim. If you see what I mean. Then there's finally, in that regard, to the radiation theory, supernatural radiation theory. I've mentioned this several times in posts online, that there's a real problem when supernaturalist Christians believe that the carbon-14 dating results were skewed by the very radiation that caused the resurrection. seems like they're getting two things mixed together, which don't go together very well. If there was a miraculous resurrection, a great miracle, which brought Jesus back to life, or a new form of life, and if that same radiation then skewed the cloth so that 20th century testing would make it appear that it was a 14th century object, then there's a kind of a self-contradiction there, a self-destruction. It's almost as if God had shot himself in the foot in the process of causing this resurrection. So that is a problem with it. On the other hand, if there was some sort of natural radiation, and we can talk about that maybe, some sort of natural radiation, you would not have a contradiction, an inherent contradiction. It could have caused the image on the shroud, and it could also have caused the skewed carbon-14 dating, if it was skewed. Okay.
Gotcha. I'm going to throw in a fault, if it's okay with you.
Yeah.
That I find this theological. I'm a philosopher as well, so I find that it makes God kind of a trickster argument. So let's say Bob Rucker's hypothesis is true, for example, or radiation, neutron absorptions threw it off. So in the process of raising Jesus from the dead, creating these miraculous images, it also throws off the carbon dating to the medieval period, and that's kind of makes God seem like a trickster. One thing I wanted to ask you though is, well, what about the other stuff? Like, because the carbon dating, Bob also mentions, well, there's also the range and the slope of the dates obtained through carbon dating, and that suggests it's not medieval, it goes back to Jesus again. So could that maybe be sort of a counter that, well, sure, the medieval dates came about, but we also have this evidence suggesting the medieval dates were wrong at the same time. Do you think that was God being a trickster at all, or?
Yeah, I think I see where you're coming from. That although there was this original 1988 announcement, that we have since then noticed the gradation in the dates and so on. I would say two things. First of all, it's a wonderful question for me because I can say honestly, I'm completely incompetent in that area, and I can't pretend to offer any sort of reasonable view. But I'd also have to say too that these latest discoveries are rather late in the day, if you know what I mean. It's been how many years since 1988? It's been 30 some years, and they really did damage the world opinion of the Turin Shroud very seriously. And I don't know, many people probably won't ever be open to considering it authentic because of that dating. Now, down the road, who knows? Yeah. We can certainly hope things will change. And, down the road, it may be possible to reproduce the shroud in a natural way. That would be very interesting. If enough experiments are done on full bodies, either mammals or med school cadavers, perhaps a full body image like the one on the shroud can be produced. Which would go a long way towards supporting the authenticity case. There may also be a number of new textual discoveries, historical writings. There's certainly been a lot of them found just within the past 50 years, so there are undoubtedly more to come down the road. So I hope that is a rambling answer, but I might have answered your question.
You did, yeah. No, and sorry I threw that in there, but I was just kind of interested in your theological take. So thank you for that. Okay, so coming to the last question on the list. Great, you've given your take on the shroud skeptical artistic mechanisms. You've given your take on looking at supernatural ones. Okay, I want to throw it to you. What's your best guess as to how these images were formed then? Yeah.
Right. Yes. Well, again, many researchers in the past have been supporters of the natural formation process, and I follow them. Yves Delage, I mentioned him earlier, Paul Vignon, Ray Rogers, Alan Adler, Barry Schwartz, Ray Schneider, who passed away just a few years ago, Marcel Alonso. Lately, I believe Kelly Kearse has done some interesting experiments with the Maillard reaction, biochemical formation. Professor Dan Spicer, Giovanna DeLiso. So there have been a lot who have supported the natural formation process, not just me. Also, you've got many instances in the past where similar processes have been observed. In the 1940s, there was the so-called Falkringer images of flowers and plants transferred from the flower itself to the page opposite it in a very, very precise manner. So that's a similar case of a projection or contact, certainly, maybe projection as well. The Jaspis imprint you've heard of, undoubtedly. It was made apparently in the 1970s. It formed, I should say, it formed in the 1970s on a hospitalized man who was dying in England, and it is an image preserved on his bed sheet of his arm, including his hand. And it's not perfect. It's a little distorted, but the very fact that there's a rather impressive image of his whole arm and his hand comes close to what we see in the shroud, in a minor way, perhaps. But anyways, and then the Maillard reaction, again, all of the investigation into that. Paul Vignon's vaporography. In addition to those biochemical possibilities, there's also the electromagnetic possibility that some source of radiation outside the body could have produced the image that we see on the shroud. Terms like charge separation come to mind. Dan Spicer proposed that. Seismic activity is another possibility. Giovanna DeLiso did a number of experiments that seem to show seismic activity causes electromagnetic radiation, which produces images if they are properly set up and so on. I've also made the point that we actually can see remarkable and perfect images every day of our lives on still bodies of water, like ponds and lakes. If they are still enough, you can see reflections. And what are they? They are perfect images of the background view, scenery, and they are projected by the world of physics and optics onto the body of water, and they're everywhere to be seen. In that case, however, there's no permanent retention of the images. It's all transitory. So it's a bit different from the shroud, but also a bit like it as well. Those are a couple of my, or a few of my suggested ways that the image may have formed. Maybe also there was an internal electric source, again, natural. The crucifixion itself may have played a part in producing the image. If you think of crucifixion, it's probably the most horrific form of execution in world history. Well, one of them certainly, this excruciating pain for hours and hours. And I can imagine that it would overload the body with just rending nerves and suffering, and physiological effects must have occurred, whether they're only biochemical or also perhaps electrical in the certain nervous system of the body. I read an interesting book several years ago called The Body Electric, and it goes into great detail about the human electrical system and also that in many animals that we know about. So people might want to think in the future a little bit more about the possibility that not a resurrection, but the crucifixion itself was the major factor in producing the image. Of course, we cannot do any experiments in that regard, so it might go without final resolution, but it's out there at least, and so as
Interesting.
an idea. And others have mentioned that too, not just me, others before.
One thing, just finishing off, I'm kind of interested. I want to get your take on this as a follow-up. So let's pretend you're right, and the shroud images were formed naturalistically, not artistically, but through some kind of process involving a dead body that was crucified in that. Some people make, but the shroud images are unique. Wouldn't we have at least 2 or 3 other burial shrouds where they would also have images that we see with the shroud and all of its features? Why is the shroud unique? Yeah.
Right. Very good question. Very good. And people often raise that. And the explanation given typically has been that no other shrouds have ever been recovered from a buried person so quickly as the shroud of Jesus was recovered. What was it? 36 hours later, according to the gospel stories. And soon after 36 hours, of course, a body begins to decompose. And within just 4 or 5 days, the decomposition is so far advanced that you get, the graphic details, and that would, of course, discolor completely the cloth that covered the body. So there's that problem. And then I can't think of any or many cases where a body has actually been dug up, a week or 2 after burial. It's extremely rare. And so those 2 factors are involved. And then I just mentioned crucifixion. Of course, that was rather rare. Not rare enough, unfortunately. There were certainly tens of thousands of victims, but it was rare enough that there just weren't many victims who were then discovered who had suffered crucifixion. And most of them, by the way, as you certainly know, Dale, most of them, almost all of them, were not given a decent burial. They were not given a dignified burial in a tomb, but they were just thrown into the common pit. So they had no shroud at all.
Gotcha. Yeah, or left up on the cross to be eaten by scavengers. Yeah.
Right.
Awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, so that does it for my list of questions. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Actually, yeah, before we end, is there anything that I missed that you think is important just to share with the audience, or you think we covered it all, or?
I'm not very good at answering that. I guess just be safe, of course, everyone. We're still living in the days of COVID, and it's a threat. And try to be reasonable about these matters. Keep searching, keep seeking the answer there. Maybe also don't spend as much time on the Shroud of Turin as I have in my life. I kind of regret sometimes that I've spent many years on and off, of course, part-time now, just thinking about it and reading about it. There are many other very, very important issues in life, and so on. My main concern these days, I might throw this in, it's unrelated, but I'm very, very concerned about the global warming, climate change situation. It's a crisis. I think almost all of us realize that now, getting worse very, very rapidly. So I hope that many of your viewers take that seriously and also try to do something about it in their own lives. We can all reduce our use and abuse and waste of energy, and we can write and telephone to our representatives in Congress, in politics, and insist that they pass policies that will address the problem. So.
All right, awesome. Yes, but yeah, once again, I will say thank you so much for coming on. You're welcome back anytime for any topic you want to talk about.
Thank you.
No problem. Cool. So with that, I think we'll close it out. Just so the audience knows, what I have next week is so going with John's advice here, we're going to take a break from the Shroud. We've had a lot of Shroud focused episodes. Next week it will be a Theo Geeks podcast on looking at Genesis, and are men and women equal according to Genesis or not? So we'll be debating that. So yeah, with that said, have a great week, and thanks again for being on there, John.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Awesome. All right. Have a great week.